I'm Rebecca and welcome back to my sewing room. Today I have a couple of pieces from my antique collection to show you, and they correspond to something that I was talking about in my second to last vlog, last week's vlog, when I was working on my Edwardian outfit, which is they are both gimps. And so I want to tell you a little bit about gimps to begin with. And I may not be pronouncing this word correctly. As you can see, this is how it's spelled, Guimpe, and it's French. And I don't speak French, so I've heard that it may actually be pronounced guimpe in the French, but most customers tend to call it a gimp. So what is a gimp? A gimp is a sort of underblouse that goes underneath another dress, whether that's like a jumper dress or just a dress with maybe a lower neckline and shorter sleeves. And a gimp tends to have at least 3/4 length, if not long sleeves, and almost always has a high neckline, though it could have some other sort of nice collar instead of the high neckline. But it seems like the era that gimps were most worn was kind of the turn of the century through the early-ish teens, early to mid-teens. So I would say kind of from the late 1890s through the early teens, kind of that 20-year period is really when you see gimps being worn the most. So what makes a gimp different than a chemisette? A lot of us know about chemisettes from maybe the Regency period or even the early to mid-Victorian period. A chemisette fills in that neckline area, but it really doesn't do anything with the sleeves. So gimps are really an entire bodice almost that have the decorative sleeves and they have the decorative neckline. But the bodice itself, the part that wouldn't be shown underneath whatever you're wearing it, that is plain. And that is how you can tell if you come across an antique, for example, that this is not an over bodice or an outer bodice. This is actually a gimp or an under bodice. So I happen to have two gimps in my collection, one black, one white. And I would also even be inclined to say I have one that is really more evening and one that is day wear, just from the fabrics that they are made out of. And I want to show you both of those gimps today. These are the two gimps. Both of them, I believe, are from fairly close to the same period. This one, I think, is right around from the beginning of the 1900s, and I say that really only because of the bust ruffle on the gimp, and that just helps to lead to a little bit more of that pigeon-fronted look. Now, clearly, my exposure on my camera is being really thrown off by trying to film white and black together at the same time. So we are going to take a closer look at one gimp at a time so that both of them show up properly. Let's start with an overview of the entire garment. Starting up by the neckline, we have a very high collar that is bound at the top with silk, and it is boned on the sides with multiple bones, and both the tiny collar and the neckline area are filled in with a lace that is beaded underneath the lace with tiny, shiny, sparkly beads. Moving on down farther to the bodice section, we have our lovely bust ruffle, which has tiny little pleats that it's all set in, and the world's tiniest little narrow hem. Coming over to the sleeves, just at the upper bicep, our fancy sleeve begins, meaning this was probably worn under something that had relatively short sleeves because it starts so high. This sleeve is a silk fabric, and it has rows and rows of tiny little tucks all the way down the sleeve. There are 17 pin tucks in all. Each one, if I had to guess without measuring, about 3/4 of an inch away from each other. These are pressed in various ways, and I don't know if that is just something due to time or if they were originally done that way, but you have some of them pressed up and some of them pressed down. Continuing on down the sleeve, We have a little bit of a flap at the bottom of the silk section, and then we come back to lace for the very bottom of the sleeve and the beading down to the tiny little cuff end, which is again edged with silk. The inside of the lace is netting, so that protects the wearer from the beads and also from the lace. And there are beads set along the outside of the sleeve edge, though most of these no longer actually exist. As you might have noticed, this is an extremely short, cropped bodice area, hitting probably just below the bust. This helps to remove any additional bulk that would have wound up in the waistline, because that's not necessary, and we're never going to see this interior section that is worn underneath, so it really doesn't matter how far down it goes. But by having it over the bust and having that ruffle in there, it does provide a little extra oomph to get that pigeon-fronted look. Now let's take a quick look at the back of the bodice. The back closes up with hooks and bars, and you'll notice that the hooks are nicely set in here. We'll go inside and take a closer look at those in a moment. And one thing I want to point out is that there is a little bit of maybe either patching or piecing right here on the shoulder. There is a little bit of staining on the back of this gimp, but otherwise it is in perfect condition. Probably because it is so tiny and was really not able to be worn by anyone besides the original wearer. In fact, to give you an idea of just how small this bodice is, I wanted to share with you a few measurements. The shoulders are approximately 10 3/4 inches across the top of the shoulders. The neck is approximately 5 1/4 inches laid flat, meaning 10 1/2 inches total around the base of the neck, and around the top of the neck is 10 inches total. Across the bust, it is 14 3/4 laid flat, almost 15, so just shy of 30 inches total over the bust. And there is no waist, so it's really pretty impossible to measure. The waist would probably be about 2 inches below where this crops off. Moving over to a sleeve, the wrist is approximately 3 1/4 laid flat, so 6 1/2 inches around. And the bicep is approximately 5 3/4 laid flat, so 11 1/2 inches around. Now let's take a look at the inside. The first thing you might notice is this heavily boned collar. There are actually 8 pieces of boning in this collar, pretty much everywhere except the center front of the collar. There is boning right where the hooks and bars are at the edges, and the boning gets progressively shorter, as does the collar. If you notice, the collar is definitely taller in the back than in the front, and the bones go all the way to about, I would say, about 3 1/2 inches away from the center. Oh, I'm good, aren't I? 3 1/2 inches. Now let's look a little farther into the neckline. We can also see the running stitches that are used to put on the finishing with this satin edge. We can't see any of that on the front side, but it's probably because there are 2 folds here of the satin, and that running stitch is affixing the folds to the lace of the neckline. As I mentioned earlier, all of the lace is backed with netting, and that's both in the collar and in the neckline area as well as in the sleeves. We have some really nicely closed in, I think these maybe are French seams. There's no exposed edges here in the seams on the shoulder, and the lace collar edge actually goes on top as in the outside of the really lightweight cotton that makes up the interior and is folded under on the outside and then finished with more running stitches. The cotton, on the other hand, has tiny machine stitches finishing its edge, and really everywhere that it has machine stitching, it is tiny machine stitches, including this area that I'm still not sure if this is a patch or a piece. So these shoulders are really interestingly constructed. I found that piecing or patching on the outside, but actually the inside is very odd as well. Just let you get a close look of that. I'm really not even sure how to describe that, but basically there is the layer that makes up the body of the front is actually coming around over here and being hand whipped down to another layer, which is the exterior. So I'm not sure why they did a lap there, but it's an overlap and both edges have been hand whipped down and is attached to the layer that is the exterior. So there's a lap here and I'm really not sure why they would have done that, but both edges have been folded under and then either machine sewed in this case or hand sewed in the interior's case down. The exterior is what goes into the sleeve seam. This, by the way, is an extremely lightweight cotton. I think maybe the best modern comparison would be a batiste. This is really very, very fine, but again, in fantastic condition, which is wonderful. We have French seams over here in the side. I think these are French seams. I'm not really great with my construction names, but basically it's a seam that has been done in and is folded down on both sides and stitched. Never mind, I don't know what this is. No, this is not a French seam. Never mind. The seams on the side are very odd. They didn't actually do a good job of catching all of this. The edges have been turned over individually, stitched together, and then they have made another seam here. So it's a very interesting finish. And if you know the name of this finish, please comment it down below. The hooks are all covered over with a little bit of, I guess it's a facing, a tiny little narrow facing here. And there is another seam down the center front of the bodice. There are also tiny, tiny seams that go down underneath the arm because the back is actually made up of two pieces. This piece, side back, and then the back piece. And that is it for the construction details on the Ivory gimp. Now let's move to our fancier cousin, the black sequined gimp. So I believe that this gimp actually closes up the front and not the back. And I say this for a couple of reasons. One, this side of the gimp has darts in it as opposed to seams, and that is standard bodice construction to have darts in the front and seams in the back. Two, typically in this era, which is again the turn of the century, you see a lot of collars that on front closing bodices that will close up the front and then wrap around the neckline, having more tiny hooks and eyes here, and then continue on to the back and have a center back closure. And that's exactly what this neckline is. So that's why I believe this not only to be a front closing bodice, but also to actually probably be a little bit earlier than the other bodice. This one I think may even be late 1890s, because I have seen that sort of closure of the neckline more commonly in the very late 1890s, very early aughts, as opposed to even just a little bit later into the 20th century. when the collar closures were slightly different. So let's take a closer look at this bodice. This bodice is so fancy. You can just see all of the sparkle that this will have made, particularly if the wearer was around maybe gaslight or candlelight. This just has so much movement and sparkle to it. And that is because it is covered with probably thousands of little spangles, all neatly hand sewn on, all over the sleeves and the neckline. The neckline takes it one step further and really goes for it around the collar, which is just fantastic. Now on the flip side, the bodice is just a polished cotton, and this is a highly structured bodice. Just wait till we take a look at the back. You can see just how many seams are in this thing, but this is a very highly structured bodice. Once again, I think that this gimp really benefits from survivor bias because, again, this is a pretty small garment. I'll show you the measurements in a little bit, but it is quite tiny. These are really two of the tiniest pieces, I think, in my collection. So if we take a closer look at the sleeve here, we can see some of the other decoration. It has these wonderful ruffles all along the wrist, which are kind of a ruched ruffle. And I believe, though I don't want to swear to it, but I believe that this is, maybe that this was an organdy. It's a lot softer now, but it definitely still has some body. And it's been pulled up and ruched and stitched just down the center. And the same thing has been done on the very edge of this sleeve. Now, right here on the very end of the sleeve, the netting is just netting by itself. However, everywhere else on the bodice, the netting is backed. So looking at this sleeve, which this sleeve opens up the side so that it can get a really nice tight fit around the wrist with a little thread covered hook and eye. Well, the hook's not thread covered, but a thread covered eye and a hook. And if we look at the interior of the sleeve here, we can see that this is actually backed by, I believe, chiffon. Whatever it is, it's quite tightly woven, but very sheer and very lightweight. And you can see we actually have multiple thread loops closing up the wrist. Looking really closely at the construction here, this sleeve ruffle was actually attached to the edge end sleeve ruffle first, and then both at the same time were hand sewn to the rest of the sleeve. And we've got pretty decent sized running stitches here, but no sign of the machine stitches that are holding the ruffle in place. So that's why we can tell that that was done first, and then those were attached as one to the rest of the sleeve. The sleeve here is a two-piece sleeve, fairly fitted, with the underside piece being very narrow. You can just see the lines where the seams are going all the way up the sleeve. These seams are, I believe, done by machine and then hand whipped over the edge. And even into the shoulder, they are pretty fitted. All right, let's take a look at the back and then we'll take a look at the interior. The most interesting thing about the back to me is just how many pieces make up the back. If you remember from the front, we had one piece making up the entire front with two darts on each side, but the back actually has 6 pieces just from the side seams over here all the way to the back in a very narrow space. So we have our side back, our side center back, and our center back, and that is what makes up the back, plus then of course the yoke, which is our lovely beaded yoke. And you can see the closure of the collar here which opens up like this. I'm gonna need two hands to do this, and I'm holding the camera, so I will have to put the camera on the tripod to show you exactly how this closure works. But you can at least see here the bone that makes up the center back plus the hooks. Okay, now let's take a look at the interior. This is how the collar opening is done. So again, we're looking at the back right now to start. So it unhooks here, continues to unhook here, where we're hooked in actually a hook that runs kind of opposite direction of where you would think it would be. It's not hooking down like that, it's hooking around like this, and that goes to a thread bar right there. And that continues. We have more of those hooks that go down and around, all the way around. Now we're going to pause this, flip it over carefully, and I'll show you how the rest of it opens up. Now that we've opened the collar, I can show you how the rest opens, which is just with hooks and thread loops down the front until it gets to the cotton part of the bodice, at which point it becomes hooks and eyes. And these are weirdly alternating too. Normally when you see alternating hooks and eyes, you're gonna see every other. These are 2 bars, 1 eye, 2 bars, 1 eye, or vice versa on this side, 2 eyes, 1 bar. So I've never seen that on anything else before. We also have a very, very large hook at the very top of the cotton part of the bodice. The rest of these are slightly more average size. And these are the same size as, for example, the one that is at the collar. Now, I do want to point out, since I just noticed this actually, that there aren't any signs even of hooks and bars on the mesh part of the gimp. We literally have one right here at the collar base, and then we have our next one here at the top of the bodice. So otherwise it just overlaps, which is very, very interesting, especially seeing as how that is most likely the front of the bodice. Let's take a look inside. You can see she has been beautifully finished. I mean, really just gorgeous. And you can also see when we look in here, really pretty much the only place that this bodice has really sustained any damage. And that is actually just to the lining, the chiffon lining of the neckline right here in front, as well as to a slightly higher degree right where the collar connects, and that's just because strain has been put on the collar right here. So this area is torn, both the mesh with the sequins on it as well as the chiffon, and then the chiffon here has just some little holes that looks more like maybe a shattering type hole. There's some more in here as well, but the rest of the bodice is actually in quite good condition. Just compared to the ivory bodice, the condition is not great on this one. So you can see she has been beautifully finished in here. All of these seams are done in what I think is a version of a French seam. Generally, when I see French seams, the interior is protected because you've had a seam and you've turned it the other way around, and then you have another seam here. But this actually has a row of exterior stitching here and then the seam here. So I don't know if that means that there's actually 3 rows of stitching here, one there, and then one inside basically, or if this has been, the edges have been folded and this has actually been kind of top stitched, getting both of those in place after they've been folded and then the seam has been done. I don't know enough about fancy seam finishes to know the term for that. So again, if you know the term for that, it's very similar to on the ivory bodice, please let me know what that might be. They've actually even done the same thing to the darts in this bodice. They are also treated with the little row of stitch line here and then the stitches here. These are all machine stitches, by the way, that make up the structure of this bodice. So the hem of this bodice is turned over with what feels like a silk taffeta, and that is just nicely stitched in place both on the very edge and a little bit higher up at the edge of the silk taffeta. There are also little silk, not taffeta, this is like a China silk, loops to hold this for if it's going on a hanger, for example, to hold this in place so that no strain is put onto the weaker fabric of the shoulders. I know I said that it was a polished cotton before, and that is what it looks like on the outside. It looks like a polished cotton. The inside definitely looks like a cotton sateen, kind of similar to today's Supima cotton, that grade of shininess. I mean, if you look at it, the way it's reflecting, it almost looks like a silk, but it is definitely a cotton. So it's just one of those sateens where you have a slightly duller exterior, and that is what they've used for the exterior of the bodice. Now in this one, the lace is again stitched down on the exterior of the bodice, having been folded up along the bottom so that no raw edges are shown. And then that lace has all been hand stitched in place, both along the very top edge of the cotton and then again along the bottom edge of the lace. And when I say lace, I mean the net and chiffon combo, but the decorative fabric. One other thing about the interior, let's take a look at the collar. Now again, this is probably the most fragile part of this bodice, so I don't want to put any strain on, especially over on this end where it is starting to separate. But we have bones here that are all in a sort of like knit channel, almost like the binding that you see on a lot of historical extant skirts. And this collar, unlike our ivory collar, this only has 5 bones. And we do actually have bones, one bone, right in the center of the collar, which I would imagine would be very uncomfortable. This collar is also much straighter. Just by the naked eye, I can't really tell any difference between the length of the center of the collar and the length of the back or sides of the collar. That said, it is a much shorter collar, so it's probably not one that really had to curve to make it look very tall. It's been finished with running stitches along the top, which are keeping that thick beaded trim in place, and that's kind of a jet bead sequin combo on really on all of the outsides of the collar. And then the bottom of the collar is finished over with a little bit of the China silk, probably the same stuff that was used for the hangers. And that has all been whipped down by hand. Somehow a few sequins have peeked inside here, which they don't look to be sequins that were ever on the exterior of the bodice. And I find that very interesting because, for one thing, it tells me that this was probably pre-sequined fabric, and they actually cut the sequined fabric, the sequined netting, and just cut it into the shapes for the neckline and the collar and the sleeves. And probably in most cases on the seams, they have removed the sequins. However, I think they missed some, and this looks like it'd be a very uncomfortable place to have 3 sequins poking you, because that's almost right in the center back of your neckline. So it's very interesting to see those sequins there, because again, that just sounds really uncomfortable. Over here on the collar that wraps around, you can just see the beaded trim from the inside of the collar, but that is just because it is the part that wraps around. So that's not actually touching the skin. The hooks are put in very, very interestingly here because they're actually poked through the China silk. So they have been like put under the China silk, maybe. They're not stitched to the China silk as far as I can tell, but they are somehow poking through it. So I find that very interesting. I've never seen that before, and there are 3 of them in here. No, sorry, 4 of them in here doing that. And that is really it for examining this interior. Let's take a look at the measurements. All right, so starting with the shoulder to shoulder on this bodice is approximately about 11 inches flat. Looking at the waist, since this one does have a waist, making sure our hooks stay together. This is about 11¼ inches across the waist. So that is 22½ inches in her waist, very tiny. And the bust is about 16½ inches flat, so about a 33-inch bust. Taking a look at those tiny wrists, we have about a 3½ inch flat, so 7-inch wrist, which I guess isn't that tiny. It just looks really tiny. And the collar is about 6¾ inches, so 13½ inches. This one might be a little harder to measure the bicep because I can actually see where the interior chiffon is, and it's not quite, it's a little wrinkled and not quite where the netting is. So trying to measure just the chiffon, I think we've got about a 4 3/4 inch, so 9.5 inch bicep. And I think that is about it for measurements. All right, so how cool were those gimps, right? So I hope that you have enjoyed taking a look at these gimps, which I feel like are not pieces that we get to see very often, and probably pieces that a lot of people might not even know about. In fact, if this is your first time hearing about gimps, please leave me a comment below and let me know. Let me know if you have any additional information to gimps as well, because that would be really great. I would love to learn more. So I do hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did like it, please go ahead and click the thumbs up icon. And if you'd like to see more videos like this, please go ahead and click subscribe and the little bell icon to be notified every time I post a video. This is part of an ongoing series on my channel, so about once a month I have been posting videos of my antique collection. Sometimes those videos are unboxings, and sometimes those are pieces that have been in my collection for some time. Both of these, by the way, were eBay finds, 2 different sellers and 2 different times. I don't remember exactly when, but I want to say it was at least 3 to 4 years, if not more, that I added both of these pieces to my collection. So they've been in my collection for a little while, and I think that when I added them to my collection, A, I didn't know that they were gimps, and B, I didn't really know what gimps were. So it was really interesting learning about these firsthand by adding these to my collection. So if you do want to start collecting, eBay is your friend, but also your enemy, because this is a perilous place to walk. You're probably going to get addicted pretty soon if you're anything like me. By the way, I have had some requests for videos on how I store my antique collection. Now, I am not necessarily someone that you want to emulate storage-wise, because I know that I have too many pieces per box, but I will do a video at some point, probably in October, about how I store my collection. So be on the lookout for that video coming up soon. And again, don't forget to subscribe so that you know as soon as that video goes live, just like all my other videos. I do post videos to YouTube, by the way, twice a week. I do my regular programming on Friday, as well as my vlogs that come out on Tuesdays. So again, if you're subscribed, you'll be one of the first people to know every time that I post a video. Now, while I post twice a week on YouTube, I do post every day over on Instagram. So please go follow me on Instagram. That's at Lady Rebecca Fashions. And if you'd like to support me and my antique buying habit and all of the other work that I do on this channel, I have links to my Ko-fi account down in the description. Again, I hope you really enjoyed this, and I will see you very soon in my next video. Happy sewing!